Good morning, Tribe Church. On behalf of our family, we just want to wish you a happy Easter. We know that this Easter might not look like we thought it would back when we were planning it at the beginning of the year, but that's okay because we have worked hard to have an incredible service for you that we know that God is going to bless.
Alone in my sorrow and dead to my sin, lost without hope and no place to begin. Your love made a way to let mercy come in. When death was arrested and my life began, ash was redeemed, only beauty remains. My orphan heart was given a name. My morning grew quiet, my feet rose to dance. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Released from my chains, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was a ransom he faithfully bore. He canceled my debt and he called me his friend. When death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. A Savior displayed on a criminal's cross. Darkness rejoiced as though heaven had lost. But then Jesus arose with our freedom in hand. That's when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you.
you so much for joining us for our Easter Online. As we continue our time of worship today, as you listen to this next song, just hear it for what it really is. It's a prayer. Jesus told us that in this world we will have trouble, but he gives us peace. And that's what this song is, a prayer for your peace. And also, it holds true to the fact that how we feel right now, the situation we're in right now, will not last forever. And I'm not talking about COVID-19. I'm talking about an everlasting life with him in heaven, and for all of our families, for generation after generation.
The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord, turn his face toward you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord, turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Lord, turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 Amen.
His favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, in your family, in your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, in your family, in your children, and their children, and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you, all around you and within you. He is with you, he is with you in the morning, in the evening, in your coming and your going, in your
Good morning, Tribe Church. We are out here at the Summers property as the sun rises on Easter Sunday, and what a fitting way to conclude our Follow Me series. Through this series, we've taken a close look at the life of Jesus, and we've started with him on the banks of the Jordan River at the start of his ministry, all the way till today, where we celebrate his resurrection. But we still have a little bit more of the story to go through. And for many of us, this may seem like the end of something, but really it's just the beginning. And we'll jump more into that today. So Jesus, where were we at, right? Jesus had come into the town on a parade, right? The streets were lined on either side. He rode through and they were shouting out, Hosanna, Hosanna. They had seen him, speak many times. They had even seen him perform miracles. And this was their expectation that he was going to be the arriving Messiah for them. And as hard as church leaders were trying to, they just couldn't separate Jesus from the crowd. And Jesus had won over the crowd. Jesus had won over the crowd, and they knew they would never get the crowd on their side. And they also knew that at some point they had to get him separated, but they couldn't make it happen. And at some point during some meeting, one of the leaders shouted out, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him." They saw Jewish people were shouting after him, Hosanna, and you are the king, and here comes the king. And they knew they needed him to be separated from the crowd to have him arrested and ultimately put to death. Jesus was spending this time preparing his guys, right? Trying to clue them in on all that was about to happen. He wanted to show them that he didn't come to be an and, he came to be an instead of. The Passover night, he established a new covenant. Pastor Carey talked about that, right? The new covenant that was established, a new relational arrangement between God and all mankind. One that would be the fulfillment of Abraham's covenant with God and the replacement for God's covenant with the nation of Israel. Just like contracts have terms and agreements and conditions, so do covenants even in ancient times. That very night, Jesus gave them the terms and the agreements and the conditions of the new covenant. There wouldn't be 600 plus laws or a bunch of commandments. There would be just one. The new commandment. Love as I have loved you. As I have loved you, you must love one another. This would be the overarching ethic, right? The overarching morality for his brand new movement, the church. The covenant that he would establish with you, with me, and with the whole world would all start on that night. He would outline that they wouldn't be remembering the covenant they remembered before, the covenant they had always celebrated. He says, you'll do this in remembrance of me. The bread is my body and the wine is my blood. But they don't have a category, right, for any of this. It must have been so confusing for them. And as the night wore on, Jesus was more and more disturbed. Something was happening. Something was up, and Jesus was up, right? He seemed troubled. He seemed bothered. And if Jesus could be worried, he sure did seem kind of worried. And where was Judas, right? They all expected him to be back long before now. And after the supper, Jesus asked them to leave, and they're going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's an urban garden in the middle of the city. And they had been there many times, right? And they went there now, and they went there at night so that no one would recognize them, no one would see them. And Jesus asked them to stay awake with him while he goes off deeper into the garden to pray, right? So he's going to go off further in the garden, and he's going to pray alone. And he prays for a while, and he prays the prayer that we all know, right? He tells God the Father, you and I both know what's about to happen. And if I had a choice, I would choose something else. I would choose any other way than this. I would choose another route. But as always, God, not my will, but yours, right? Not my will, but yours. And he gets back to the boys and he finds them all fast asleep, right? And he's so frustrated because he knows what's about to happen. He knows everything that's about to go down. And he just wanted them to stay up with him and pray with him. He's like, you couldn't stay up with me for just 1 hour? And then Judas shows up. And he brings with him a small army of men, temple henchmen. To the shock of everyone, Jesus doesn't put up a fight. Jesus surrenders to the temple leaders. And the text says this, then everyone deserted him and fled. And the story goes on, they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. They had never been able to get this close to Jesus, right? They'd never been able to separate him, to isolate him from the crowd. They never had been able to reach out and touch him, physically touch him. And they were curious. They had a lot of questions. And now because there were more of them, and now because there were more of them than there was of him, they were emboldened. And what follows next is so interesting, and it's in so much detail. And you may read that and think, well, if everyone deserted him, then how do we know what happened? How do we know what was said, right? And that's a good question. But we can read about it in Acts, which Acts is really just a history of the early church. And it was wrote by Luke. And we find out that many of the Pharisees actually became Jesus followers. Not because of what he taught, obviously, right? They became followers after the resurrection. And no doubt, some of those very men were in these meetings and gave the gospel writers all this great detail. And we go on and read, the chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they couldn't find any. So the whole Jewish Supreme Court, right, can't find any reason to put Jesus to death. They've been mad at him for so long, but they can't find any reason to actually put him to death. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements do not agree. So they had people lie about him, and they couldn't even get those statements to agree. And then they would ask Jesus a direct question. A direct question he would refuse to answer. And finally, the high priest, the most powerful guy among them, lost his temper, right? Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer?" But Jesus remained silent, and he gave no answer. And the chief priest is really going to the heart of the matter, right? Because he really wants just one question. It's the one question that if Jesus answers incorrectly, they have all the evidence they need against him, right? They have everything they need. And so the high priest just goes ahead and asks him. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And if you think about it, in this moment, right? In this moment, Jesus held his future. He held my future, and he held your future in his hands. And he looked at the chief priests and men in the room whose motives were nothing. They were not pure. They were far from pure. And he said, I am. And the high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You heard the blasphemy." And they tore their clothes to show their lament and their anguish at this blasphemy, at this wrongdoing that this man had done. And he's like, "We've all witnessed what just happened. We all witnessed what he just said. We don't need anything else." And they all condemned him to death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and they beat him. And the men in the room who were in charge had what they needed to condemn him to death. And they conspired together to figure out what the next step was to enact their plan. And we don't know if they were up all night, right? But I'm betting Jesus didn't get much sleep that night. But we do know this. The text says this, that very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the teachers in the law and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. Having determined guilt, they needed Rome, right, in order to be able to fulfill their sentence. Their plan was simple. The plan was they needed to convince Pilate that they needed to execute Jesus before Passover. And then they could all go back to business, right? The city would settle down. The people would give up on this Messiah hope, and things would go back to the way that they had always been. And they wanted this to be done before sunset, because Passover came the next day. And the best way for them to have that happen is for Pilate to do their bidding. So they bound Jesus and they led him astray and they handed him over to Pilate, it says. Now Pilate had been the governor of Judea or Jerusalem and the province of Samaria. And he had been the governor for about 7 years. And we know from the history that Pilate could not stand the Jews. He couldn't stand the Jews. He didn't even like to go into the city of Jerusalem. He actually lived on a palace on the coast, right? So he only came into Jerusalem for major celebrations like Passover. That's why he's even there, is because Passover's about to happen. And his favorite part of everything was antagonizing the Jews, right? He antagonized the Jewish leaders, and he reminded them that they were all under the authority of Rome. And he relished in that. He loved their groveling. So by now it was early morning, and to avoid the ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So they went through a series of elaborate cleansings, right? Elaborate rituals in order to be able to take part of the Passover. But they knew the moment they stepped over the threshold into Pilate's home, into any Gentile's home, they would have to go through that whole process again. They would have to start the whole cleansing process all over again. So imagine the hypocrisy of all of this, right? They wouldn't cross a threshold, but they had insisted and brought along an innocent man to be condemned to death. So Pilate came out and asked them, what charges are you bringing against this man? Because he has to actually come out of his house because they won't go into his home at all, right? It's early. I'm coming out of my house to have a talk with you. What is this all about, right? But they had a prepared statement. If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Translation, let's not get bogged down in the details, right? That's not important. We need a favor. We need a kindness from you, right? We've been through this before. We wouldn't have brought him to you if this wasn't important. And we certainly wouldn't have brought him to you the day before Passover's to begin if this wasn't vitally important to us. And Pilate loved it when the Jewish leaders needed a favor. All of this was music to Pilate's ears, right? So he eggs them on and he says, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. He was taking that moment to acknowledge Rome's sovereignty over the whole Jewish situation, right? He's like, oh, go ahead and do whatever you're going to do, right? You guys go ahead and do it. He took a moment with that. And I'm sure they sighed and they looked at him because they all knew this situation. And they say, but we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. Ah, that's right. That's right. He enjoyed that very much, right? Like that's the truth right there. You have no right. You have no power to impose even your own laws. That's right. You're under my authority. And then Pilate did something else that really irritated them. He went back into his palace, knowing they couldn't follow, right? They wouldn't follow, and they were too good for that. But he insisted that they bring Jesus in. So Pilate went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Now imagine, outside, the Jewish leaders are losing their minds, right? Because they're afraid that if Pilate gets one-on-one with Jesus, that Jesus will do that Jesus magic, right? He won over the crowds. He won over everyone else. If he gets one-on-one with Pilate, we will not win. He will convince Pilate that we are in the wrong because he swayed the crowds. He swayed the nation, right? Who knows what he might be saying to Pilate? They didn't anticipate that because they refused to go into Pilate's home, that Pilate might just invite Jesus in. Because Jesus seemed to have no reservations about going into Gentiles' homes, right? And spending time with sinners. In fact, that was part of the problem with Jesus to begin with. And now it seemed like it might be their undoing. But Pilate goes right to the heart of the matter, right? Because he had heard the rumors. He had heard about the rabbi from Galilee coming to Jerusalem. He had heard about the parade. He had seen the crowds, and the soldiers had probably told him, sir, we're on the verge of riots because of this rabbi, right? And now Pilate can finally ask his questions. Are you the king of the Jews? And it says that Jesus says, is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me? And I'm sure Pilate's on edge by this response. He comes back at him. He's like, am I a Jew? Pilate replied, your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you have done? You know, why are you here so early in the morning? Don't you understand the stir, the problems that you have created, the chaos? And Jesus does answer his question because he's like, yeah, I am a king. But Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not like what you have here, right? My kingdom is vastly different. If it were, right, we know that's how it would play out. It would play out the same way anytime someone claims to be the Jewish Messiah or claims to be the king of Israel, right? anytime this happens, if it were my servants, right? My servants would fight my arrest. They would prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. If my kingdom was part of this world, Pilate, I would have outroamed Rome. I would play by the rules and I would use force because that's the way of things. But my kingdom is nothing like anything that you're familiar with, right? My kingdom is unlike anything on this planet. Pilate is like, at least we're getting somewhere. So you are a king then, Pilate says. And then Pilate announced to the chief priests in the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But they insisted. He stirs up people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and he's come all the way here. Someone shouldn't have said Galilee because Pilate has to be thinking, Galilee? That's not even my jurisdiction, right? This isn't even my problem. You've come to the wrong person. You have to take him to Herod. He's in charge of Galilee. I'm sure they all shouted at that person. We all agreed we weren't going to mention Galilee. You're ruining the plan, right? As it turns out, Herod is the son of Herod the Great, who actually built the temple. Herod the Great, who sent his henchmen in to kill all boys that were under the age of 2 because they could grow up and take his throne, right? Of course, Herod the Great died just like everyone else, so he was trying to prevent someone from taking his throne, but ultimately that was going to happen no matter what. And his sons controlled part of the area at that time. His son Herod was the governor of Galilee, and he happened to be in town because of the Passover. So Pilate's like, this isn't my jurisdiction. Herod's in town, so just take him to Herod. So Pilate hands Jesus back over to them, and the Jewish leaders take him to Herod, and Jesus goes into Herod's house. And Herod is thrilled to see Jesus because just like Pilate, he had heard all the rumors, right? He's never been able to get this close though to this Jesus person. He's never been able to have a one-on-one conversation with him, but he's heard all of the rumors, right? So he's asking Jesus questions, but Jesus won't answer any of his questions. And then he's like, all right, Jesus, just do some tricks, right? I've heard about the tricks. Jesus, just do some tricks. Of course, Jesus refuses to play along. And Herod gets just fed up, right? And he doesn't see what he wants to see. So he just hands Jesus back over to Pilate. He's like, all right, this is boring. You're going back to Pilate, right? And we go on and we read, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I've examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, right? He brings that up. He's like, neither did Herod. You went to Herod. Herod just sent him back to me. For he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, he's thinking, just to appease the crowd, just to get you off my front porch. Therefore, I'll punish him, and then I'll release him. But the crowd goes crazy. This isn't what they want, right? But the whole crowd shouted, away with this man, away with this man. And then Pilate took Jesus and they had him flogged. Now for first century readers, they understood exactly what it meant to be flogged. 2 Roman soldiers would use what they call a cat o' nine tails, which is like a whip with like 9 tails on the end of it. And they would have bone and metal fragments tied to the end. And they would stand behind the man who was bound and they would place his hands over his head as far as they could stretch out. And then they would take turns and they would count, because even the Romans had rules when it came to flogging. But they would take turns and they would count, and the pieces of the bone and the metal would tear into the skin and they would rip out pieces. And the whips actually, because they were facing behind them, would actually curl around to the front of the gut with no protection whatsoever and rip out pieces of flesh time after time after time. And people died from flogging, right? They bled out to death, or they would die of infection afterwards. And here's the thing, and we have to stop for a second just to talk about it for a minute. It's virtually impossible for us not to sanitize and romanticize what happens in the next few hours in the life of Jesus. And the reason for that is most of us were taught this as children. And when you tell a child a story like this, you have to remove the blood and the guts. You have to remove the part that isn't appropriate for children, right? And for many of us, the last time that you heard this story was as a child. And the last time maybe you even heard someone read this story was as a teenager, right? So you end up with this PG or PG-13 version of the story. But as adults, we shouldn't sanitize it. We shouldn't put some dramatic music behind it just to make some spiritual moment, because it was anything but that. To maintain our childlike view of the story is to actually miss the story. Because here is the truth. We would all look away. That's the truth. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and they put it on his head. And they clothed him in a purple robe. And they put this over his bloody, beaten, and raw body, right? They clothed him in that purple robe and they went to him again and again and again, saying, "Hail to the King of the Jews." And they slapped him in the face. And the same face that had already been bruised the night before by the temple guard. And once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered here, "Look." And I love that he starts with "look" because it just reminds me of John the Baptist saying, "Look, the Lamb of God." But he says, "Look." I think he says "look" in hopes of them saying and seeing Jesus beaten and bloodied, beaten almost to death, right? In this miserable state, and saying, "Have pity." Right? Look, okay? That's enough, all right? Look what's happened. We're done, right? He's probably going to die anyways. Surely this is enough for them to leave him alone, to avoid doing something he didn't actually want to do, and get through another Passover so he could just go back to his palace on the coast and leave this whole Jewish nation behind him. Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. Even when he was being beaten to death, he did not break. Even when he was being flogged, he didn't shout out and he didn't confess to things that he knew weren't true, right? As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate can't believe this. Pilate's never seen anything like this. He's done with it. And he says, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." And Jewish leaders move on to part 2 of their plan at this point, right? They were like, "We didn't mention this earlier, but we do have this law," right? So the Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. He was even more afraid because now this Son of God thing has intersected with Roman mythology, right? With Roman legend. They had crossed over from simply being a Jewish man thing to a Roman thing. For someone claiming to be the Son of God, right, was a threat to the entire Roman Empire. This was a big deal. This was like a code word, right? The text says they took Jesus back inside, and Pilate decides to question Jesus even further. But this time, Jesus won't answer. And I love this. Especially if you're not Christian. Maybe you're watching this because you're stuck at home, or maybe you saw this on someone else's timeline and you're like, well, I wonder what an Easter service looks like, right? Why is this guy standing outside? Whatever reason you might have left church or quit believing. I mean, maybe if I was in your same shoes, I would believe the same thing. I don't want you to miss this next line, because a first century Roman soldier, right? Pilate had seen everything. And it says, Pilate was amazed. This was when men groveled and begged. This is the moment that men pleaded. This is the moment that they don't plead for their own life, they plead for death. But Jesus doesn't answer anything. Finally, Pilate gets exasperated and he's like, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have the power to either free you or crucify you?" Then Jesus could have looked at Pilate and said, "Then why are you the one who's so afraid?" But here's what he said instead. "You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Pilate had seen a lot. Pilate had seen men die in battle. Pilate had seen men die like as soon as the battle had begun. He had seen men die slowly in battle. He'd seen men bleed to death on a table, right? But he had never seen anyone like this. And when he stared into Jesus' eyes, he didn't see the eyes of a crazy man. He saw the eyes of a sincere man, of a real man. And maybe most importantly for a man like Pilate, someone who was fearless. From then on, it says Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar, and anyone who anyone who claims to be king opposes Caesar." I mean, checkmate. right? Pilate was outmaneuvered. His hands were tied. They were right. They had outed Pilate publicly, and they knew, and Pilate knew, Emperor Tiberius had spies and he had eyes everywhere. And the text says that when it finally got to this point, Pilate heard this. He brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement. And it was about noon, it says, at this time. I love that because there's so much detail at this point in the story. Here's your king, Pilate says to the king, said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him. Pilate's like, this is your king. This is your king. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. Do you really want me to crucify your king? Then someone in the crowd shouts something that at any other time or any other moment would have been considered blasphemy. It says, we have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. But he did not take it. And that was just a small gesture of mercy, honestly, but he didn't take it. And when you read this in any of the gospel, it's like time slows down, right? There's so much detail. It's like moment by moment, conversation by conversation, line by line. But then suddenly when we get to this part of the story, it just stops. Because what happens next required no explanation. And they crucified him. It was invented by the Greeks, but perfected by the Romans. And it could take a man days to die from crucifixion, depending on how healthy the man was and how well the Romans did their jobs. Because the goal was not a quick death, it was a long death. And crucifixion was so gruesome that early church leaders later banned any depiction of it, any artist rendering of it. And it was that way until the 4th century when Constantine became emperor and he banned it as a method of execution at all. And C.S. Lewis wrote this, the crucifixion did not become a frequent motive of Christian art until generations which had seen real crucifixions were all dead. There was nothing glamorous about it. It was a horrible, horrible way to die. It was a death that was given to many, but it was chosen by only one. Our Savior displayed on a criminal's cross, and darkness rejoiced as though heaven had lost. Here's something you should know, and maybe you haven't heard before. When Jesus died, there were no more Christians. There were no more believers. Sympathizers, yes, but believers, no. Because throughout Jesus' ministry, he claimed to be too much. He claimed too much about himself. The central part of his ministry wasn't his stories. It wasn't even his teaching. It was what he claimed about himself. I mean, he claimed to be the resurrection. You cannot crucify the resurrection and the life, right? He claimed to be the Son of Man, the Son of God. The Son of Man and the Son of God cannot be arrested by Romans. He gave every indication that he was God's Messiah. A Messiah cannot be put to death by a foreign power. If he was dead and crucified, he wasn't who he claimed to be, and he wasn't who they believed that he was. There was no dream to keep alive. There was no movement to keep moving. It was over. And Joseph of Arimathea, who we met earlier in our journey together, they hugged their kids, they kissed their wives, and then they risked their lives for Jesus' body. Because in the 1st century, you didn't bury a body that died of crucifixion. It was thrown onto a pile of other bodies and it was left for the dogs, right? It was not a glamorous death. They went to Pilate and they probably had to give him some money just for the right of Jesus' body. He wasn't who they hoped he would be, but he deserved better than that kind of death, right? He was deserved better than to be left to the dogs. And Sabbath was on its way, right? And they needed to hurry. The other 2 criminals had their legs broken, so they couldn't push up and breathe, and they suffocated to death. And when they came to Jesus, because of all of his prior bleedings, he had actually bled to death. And Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds, And taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with spices and strips of linen with accordance of Jewish burial customs. And why did they embalm his body? Because they assumed that Jesus would stay dead. If he had been alive at this point, they would have killed him through suffocation by wrapping him in that linen. And they made their way home confused and dismayed. The next day, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was alive, the deceiver said, after 3 days, I will rise again." So they're like, we need another favor. "So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell people who have been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." And Pilate's like, "Fine, take a guard," he says. "Go and make the tomb as secure as you know how." So they went and they made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting a guard. So the Jewish leaders are in charge of making sure that no one gets into this tomb. And it matters more to them than anything else. It matters more to them than even his death. Everyone expected Jesus to do what dead people usually do, which is stay dead. And little did all of his accusers know that in the next few hours they would secure their places in history. And languages they didn't know, and places they didn't know exist. That men and women would speak their names in ways that they wish that they wouldn't. Because they would all be a footnote in the life of a rabbi from Galilee. For what they intended as the end was really just the beginning. The beginning of something brand new. The beginning of something brand new for the world, for you, and for me. Because 3 days later, the sun would rise over the city again. And most men and women would go about their day as usual, but a handful of women would go to the tomb to have a non-rushed burial for their friend and to grieve, only to find that their friend was gone. The man who claimed he would die but would rise again 3 days later would actually be missing. And history of the world would forever be changed because death had been defeated. Not just for Jesus, but for all of us. Jesus would rise again with our freedom in hand, and death would be arrested, and our lives would actually begin. And the movement that right now is spread across the nation, where churches may seem empty, hearts are full, because Jesus defeated death and is our Savior even today. Hey Tribe, we are right outside where we launched 18 months ago at the Plainfield AMC in Perry Crossing. We launched on September 16th of 2018. We're here in beautiful Plainfield, Indiana.
And we have a really big announcement that we're really excited to make.
We're excited to announce that we're launching a brand new church in Plainfield, Indiana called Tribe Church.
People who feel broken, who feel lost, who aren't sure where to turn, we want to give them a place where they can go, a place where they can become a community. And the people of Plainfield, Indiana are going to be changed.
At the launch of Tribe Church.
Yay! And since that time, we've had some really great experiences here at the theater.
It was terrible.
Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, our last Sunday at the theater was March 8th of 2020.
What we didn't know then was that that would be our last Sunday ever at this AMC.
We are thrilled to announce that we just signed a lease on a new building where we will have access 24/7.
If you're hearing some construction sounds around us right now, that's because right across the street from our new building, they are building a huge free parking garage. We could not have found a better location here in downtown Plainfield.
Right, we're right off of Vine Street. There'll be great parking right across the street. And obviously with the COVID-19, we don't know when we're gonna move in here, but we have time to get it ready. We have time to get it prepared because we believe that people are gonna be coming in mass droves to church like they never have before.
Happy Easter.
Hi everybody. Sorry to come back so soon, but we were so excited when we were out there filming that we forgot to mention the most important part, and that's how you can help. Obviously, we want you to keep giving because without that, we won't be able to get the building, but
There are two different ways that we give here at Tribe. We give through tithes and we give through offerings. A tithe is something that you give every week or whenever you're paid or however you work that out between you and God. But an offering is something above and beyond your tithe. And what we're asking for our new facility is something that's above and beyond your tithe. And it's chairs. One of the things we loved about being at the movie theater is we didn't have to set up chairs every week like
Absolutely.
so many
and we won't have to
churches.
set up chairs every week here either.
No, but we do need to buy chairs because we don't have any. And so we found some chairs that we're really excited about. I know what it is like to sit in a church and have an uncomfortable chair, one where your feet doesn't touch the floor or one that's like super flimsy or whatever. So we found some really great chairs and they're actually on sale right now for $30. And so for $30, you can get a chair for our new facility.
Yeah, if you'd be willing to commit to that, just to buy a chair for you and every member of your family and anyone that you would like to invite to Tribe, we would love that too. And obviously, we know that not everyone's in a position right now, especially during this national crisis, to be able to give. And if that's you, please feel no obligation,
Absolutely
just
not.
like always. But we
Absolutely.
know that people are dying to help with us during this time. And one of the things we've heard from Plainfield, the community, is that they need a place to drop things off, like a donation
Yeah.
center. And we haven't been able to provide that.
But now we would be able to.
So please make sure, we'll make sure we have a drop down. Text the word Tribe to 77977. We'll have a drop down that will say chairs on it and mark your donation as that. And we'll make sure all of that goes to making sure that we can seat people in our new building.